Many British observers, administrators, and scholars in the 19th century saw caste as the essence of India. It's what made India and Hindu traditions so distinct. It permeated society to its lowest levels and shaped the prerogatives of the elite. There was no equivalent in Europe, or indeed the wider world over. Caste is certainly unique for India in terms of the hierarchies binding up with the philosophical precepts of Hinduism, namely karma and dharma. But it's not unique in terms of being a social hierarchy. As we all know, social hierarchies have existed around the world since time immemorial in order to regulate social behavior and ensure political and social stability. Yet caste was also one of the most complex things the British encountered in India. The British were fascinated with it and also repulsed by it. And as a social institution, it significantly changed under British colonial rule. So in this lecture, we're going to look at how caste was affected by the colonial relationship. Did it become looser or more rigid? Specifically, we'll touch on three major themes today. First, we're going to examine the initial encounters with caste and how the British tried to understand it. Then we'll look at how caste was bound up with the imperatives of collecting revenue and colonial administration. Finally, we're going to analyze how caste was interpreted by scholars and researchers whose publications and views gave caste greater currency and legitimacy. When we step back, the broader lesson for us is to understand how caste was greatly affected by the colonial experience, and more importantly, how it became far more rigid as a result of colonial rule. Now, let's start with an overview of caste in the 18th century, when British colonial rule started to emerge. Caste has been one of the most enduring traditions of India. It has fascinated visitors since the time of the early Persian observers during the 10th century. They noted how some Hindus were, quote-unquote, above reproach, referring to Brahmins. They were almost unaccountable and above the law. Yet at the same time, they were revered and respected by kings, landlords, and the poor alike. Under the Mughals, caste was largely unaffected by the court and its policies. The Mughal Empire and rule largely left the practices and sensibilities of caste alone. In the 18th century, though, caste had started to gain in prominence. Regional kingdoms, such as the Rajput kingdoms of the West and the Maratha territories, all vaulted Brahmins into newly important positions as scribes and as ritual affirmers of Hindu sovereignty. These two kingdoms were ruled by Hindus, so they needed Brahmins to ritually affirm their rule and serve the court as their advisors. In the case of the Maratha Confederacy, Brahmins were actually in charge, administering an impressive bureaucratic state that stretched all the way into central India. And crucially, the ascendancy of India's moneylenders and bankers also affected caste in the 18th century. As scholars such as the late Professor Sir Christopher Bailey have demonstrated, many of these merchant castes started to adopt Brahmanical notions of purity and piety. Many adopted vegetarianism, used their money to patronize major shrines and temples, and they were integral to the economic life of pilgrimage cities such as Benares and Mathura. These money-lending castes started to emulate these elite Brahmanical notions of ritual purity and pollution, and it gave them religious and financial capital. With British power, things start to get really interesting. One major effect of British rule was to bring government into the lives of Brahmins more than any other government had done before in India. This is quite a vibrant historiographical debate. Historians have argued about how much colonialism affected the practices and understandings of caste. And while we will not take a side in this course, we will look at both sides of the debate. Now, which caste do you think the British noticed the most after their first years in India? You got it, Brahmins. And why do you think they were fascinated with Brahmins? There were a number of reasons. Like the earlier Persian observers, they saw an almost impervious social and religious class of priests. What we know is that the British were initially very suspicious of Brahmins, and this happened in the first few generations of British rule. This is because most of the kingdoms the British first encountered were Muslim-ruled, which meant that these Muslim rulers had no need for Brahmins at their courts. So the early British were very familiar with the Muslim precepts of government in India, but Brahmins were much more mysterious. Now, who do you think the 18th century British thought of when they saw this priestly caste in India? Well, let's think back to Europe. They got it. They thought of the Catholic Church and its priesthood. In their 18th century Protestant anti-Catholicism, the British initially equated Brahmins with Catholics and papal tyranny. Brahmins, like Catholic priests, used a sacred language, in this case Sanskrit, which very few people understood. The British also thought that the privileges Brahmins gained from Hindu and Muslim rulers, such as tax-free lands, expected alms, and in a way being above the law in terms of capital punishment, were outdated and tyrannical. For the early British, Brahmanism was just another reason why India was subject to the rule of what they called Oriental despots. But the British also quickly realized that Brahmins possessed something crucial in Indian society, and that was legitimacy and influence. This was even more the case after the uprising of 1857. Brahmins to the British were the natural leaders of Indian society, and in the post-1857 Raj, the British were very wary of upsetting the religious and cultural sensitivities of Indians. They meddled less with Brahmanical rituals, customs, and rites. Because think about it, what does the caste system offer in theory for Indian society, if not stability? And this was best seen in the formation of law under the colonial state. Now let's ask ourselves, why would law be so important for the British as rulers of India? Well, law enforced rule and allowed India, like any country, to be governed. The law was especially crucial for revenue collection, the main bottom line for the early company and the later Raj. You see, the British entered India in their newly acquired territories with little experience of, let alone knowledge of, revenue law and taxes in a non-European context. Because remember, law is not just about crimes, but also about inheritance, how land is passed down, and how the ownership of property is defined. These all needed to be understood by the British if they were to tax effectively. So the company from the mid to late 1700s aimed to rule and administer justice according to the laws of India, namely Hindu law for Hindus and Islamic law for Muslims. Of course, Muslims do not have caste as an institution, so we'll focus mainly on the drafting of Hindu law. But do you think Hindu legal traditions were anything like their Anglo-Saxon common law counterparts? Of course not. So the British had to find out what Hindu law was, who knew about it. This brought them into contact with Brahmins, who had knowledge of Sanskrit, the Shastras, and legal traditions. So it was Brahmins who were the ones who informed the British what exactly Hindu law was. They were the company's quote-unquote native informants, and this was really significant. It was the first time any ruler in India had really approached Brahmins with the stated intent of systemizing and codifying a broader legal tradition into one code. But if Brahmins were telling the British what Hindu law was, what kind of story were they probably inclined to tell? Well, one that reflected their own views. The cumulative effect of this was that Hindu law, when it was finally codified in the 1860s, had a much more scriptural and orthodox flavor. This meant that caste and its hierarchies were given greater importance than what was customarily practiced across India. And these flavors were seen by the British largely as representative of Indian tradition. The British then put these informed traditions and legal interpretations into law. And this had a huge effect. For one, it Brahmanized the Indian legal system. It gave Brahmins special privileges and places in witnessing, procedure, and legal testimony. But there was a big problem. It flew in the face of a long-established practice. Historians and legal scholars have demonstrated that, actually, most Hindus followed vibrant, non-codified practices of law that were shaped more by region and custom rather than lettered law. The Shastras and Brahmins' interpretations of them were certainly known, but never were they the sole reference point for settling legal and social disputes. But colonial law ensured that they would be. It's not that the British intended to make caste more rigid through law. The British were anxious to settle and quickly ensure legal expediency. They assumed that there was a single Hindu law for all Hindus, which was timeless and could be found in the mysteries of texts. British jurists and scholars insisted on certainty, finality, and clarity in terms that was often alien to Brahmins. For them, Indian law was too erratic. In a way, the British were very bookish in their approach to Hindu law. They didn't understand that Hindu law was constantly changing, and that Pandits, or Brahmin legal scholars, could interpret the law de novo, or newly, every time. Hindu law did not also operate on the common law notion of precedence, or stare decisis. Just to give one example, Hindu women, who were often able to inherit property, found themselves legally unable to do so after the law code was finalized. This was because the British believed that the Brahmins' treatises were more important than the actual customs practiced by everyone else. This brings us to what scholars have called the colonial archive. To some degree, caste as a category was born in the workings of colonial paperwork, the vast accumulation of statistics, organization, and paperwork by the East India Company. Or, as the anthropologist Nicholas Dirks has put it, quote, colonial conquest was about the production of an archive of and for rule. Here, we see the emergence of what we could call the taxonomical state. After the company defeated Mysore in 1799, the colonial state became increasingly paper-driven. In South India, we do see a major change under colonialism that affected caste. In many of these regions, tribute was the way in which rulers, kings, and chieftains obtained their revenue. There was paperwork, but it was rudimentary and sometimes patchy. It was only in the Mughal heartland of North India where a more regular, paper-driven revenue administration had emerged before the British. But in South India, with the expansion of company power, tribute was too informal for the British. They wanted paperwork, documented assessment, and regularity. So they largely threw tribute out the historical window. Now, what would the colonial state need to know in terms of information about the land for taxing? In short, everything. The company wanted fiscal intelligence. British assessors and surveyors wanted to know about everything: proprietary holdings, land tenures, rates of assessment, grain types, grain prices, regularity of rainfalls, you name it. But this also included the castes and occupations of peoples. There were agricultural groups who the British saw as castes. Brahmins traditionally had rent-free land, and some took informal shares of village agricultural harvests to support temples and religious scholarship. Caste, in a way, punctuated the daily rhythm of agriculture and taxation. So in South India, the British were the first to really systematize the relationship between taxes and caste. They created categories of agricultural castes and commercial castes and tribes. And because in South India, Brahmins were such a small percentage of the population, yet held so much influence, all these other groups were judged against this so-called Brahmanical standard. The development of the first All-India census in 1871 was another factor that made caste more rigid. Now, why would the British need a census? Well, to know their subjects, mainly for the purpose of more efficient taxation. There were strategic reasons the British needed to know the country, too. If you know one town had a Hindu population, you might avoid a possible riot by stopping a Shia Muslim religious procession from traveling through. More generally, such statistical knowledge could help the Raj in intelligence and, more bluntly, counterinsurgency. But the main priority from the beginning was to make taxation more efficient, accurate, and effective. The British needed to know who was where for streamlining taxation. For example, you can't tax people effectively if you don't know where they live, what they do, or what their occupations are. As a result of decades of categorization and research, the Indian census was meant to demonstrate the power of the colonial state and the might of the British. They knew more about their empire than the Mughals ever did. But there were some downsides to the census, particularly in terms of caste. Of course, individual Indians were asked what their religion, region, and languages were. Think about it. After, "What is your religion?" what would be the next logical question to ask in India? Well, if the respondent was Hindu, then the next question was, "What is your caste?" Caste, therefore, became a crucial component of the Indian census. The census became the statistical reference board for anyone researching India's demographics. It would later be used by Indian nationalists to mobilize tactics, and by Hindu revivalists to reform caste, and by the British Raj to argue that Hindus were too divided by caste and discrimination to deserve self-rule. And one more thing. Does the census ever go away? Well, no. It stays with you for the rest of your life. And for Indians, it would be referred to by later and future generations. So you can see how powerful the effect of the census and caste really was. Furthermore, the census reaffirmed caste in the way the British categorized lower castes. What the colonial census and administration did was to classify these tribes as, quote, other backward castes and depraved castes. These became official government-sanctioned designations and categories. So the effect of this was to reaffirm, in a way, that caste was a system and a hierarchy. Now, there were also religious dimensions which made caste a more rigid category. Now, we think about it, what are the other religious traditions of India besides Hinduism? Well, Islam, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism. Do any of them have caste? Well, in theory and often in practice, no. So to the British, the distinguishing feature of Hindus compared to Muslims, Buddhists, Sikhs, and Jains was caste. They all might share similar regional languages and cultures, but caste is what distinguished Punjabi Hindus from Punjabi Muslims. And even if it varied in practice in regions across India, caste was still there. So through a process of elimination in colonial taxonomy, the British defined Hindus as distinct from everyone else in India through the category of caste. Now, let's turn to British views and scholarship about caste itself. And these ideas had as much an effect upon the practice and rigidity of caste as did the actual concrete changes in law and the colonial state. Now, British views of caste were not monolithic. There were differing views among the British in India, and they all had different ideas as to what it was all about. So let's look at some of these differences. Do you remember which area of India the British conquered first? That's right, Bengal. British perceptions of caste were always colored by the Bengal experience. Bengal was slightly different from other provinces in India when it came to caste and its practice. Of course, it had the traditions of caste and, of course, Bengali Brahmins. But compared to other regions, such as South India and the Gangetic Plain, Brahmins in eastern India were more likely to be large landholders. In southern and western India, for example, Brahmins were more likely to be scribes and paper managers working for government. In parts of the Gangetic North, many high-caste Brahmins were landless and relatively poor. And there were also dietary differences. Bengali Brahmins were often pious vegetarians who ate fish, while in southern and western India, vegetarianism was more strictly adhered to. So the point is that there was no real colonial consensus on caste. It varied from province to province, and so did British attitudes. In some regions, governors saw caste as more crucial. In South India, for example, Brahmins were in smaller numbers, but held a disproportionately greater dominance of the social and religious affairs than in North India. In the Punjab, by contrast, caste was seen more in agricultural and occupational terms. Those who tilled land were inherently lower caste. British attitudes were also complicated by the contributions of Christian missionaries. American and British missionaries did their bit to categorize castes in many ways. Now, why would missionaries want to know about caste? So they could try to find out who the lower castes and untouchables were, because they were the ones who were more likely to convert to Christianity to escape caste prejudice and discrimination. Missionaries, starting in the 1820s, actively sought to convert low castes and untouchables. To some degree, they were successful. But for missionaries, again, the identifier was a person's caste status. the lower and more downtrodden they were, the more of a target they were for proselytization and the less they had to lose from conversion. Now, how might some Brahmins and high caste Hindus see these conversions? Some of them saw this as a threat to the whole dharmic system of caste itself. Many high castes and Brahmins saw this assault on caste as an assault on Hinduism itself. But the crucial effect here was that the mass, often forced conversions of low castes in the late 19th century when famines hit made Brahmins and Hindu reformers respond on the very terms of caste identity. Caste became crucial to the debates of Hindu revivalists and reformers of the late 19th century, whether they were for caste or against it. Many moved to reform caste so that their overall numbers wouldn't drop. Hindu reformists wanted to keep the hierarchy, but get rid of some of its more pernicious practices, such as untouchability. So debates over caste reached their greatest in intensity under British colonial rule. And this had the great cumulative effect of making the system more central in Indian people's thinking. Caste was also made more important because of the expansion of British rule itself. Unlike previous rulers, the British pushed towards the frontiers of settled India more than before in regions such as northeastern India, Nepal, and parts of the Punjab. Here, the British came into closer contact with semi-settled groups such as Khatis, Gorkhas, and Jats. And because these groups sometimes didn't follow Brahmanical ritual and norms of purity and pollution, the British compared them to the main settled parts of India, where these practices were more established and followed. Yet by comparing them to a system of caste, actually had the effect of making that system more legitimate. Now, you're probably asking yourself, how exactly is it that caste became more important? And that's a great question. The answer again lies in the realm of colonial administration. This is seen particularly in how the British counted, enumerated, and categorized their subjects. We could call British rule in a way the statistical Raj. From the very beginning, the British needed to know the country, who lived in India, what they did, etc. Colonial ethnographies, statistical compendiums, and almanacs all boomed after the 1830s. These books and surveys accounted for India's various ethnicities, castes, and communities. And they all had caste as a central category, even if they didn't agree on what caste was or what its origins were. Caste was also subject to intense scholarly study by the mid-19th century. European and American professors, linguists, and scholars wrote voluminously on caste and its origins. In the 19th century, it could make your scholarly reputation and distinguish you. Let's look at how some European scholars interpreted caste. As we know, pseudo-racial sciences and studies of race were common in the late 19th century. Many scholars started to see caste as a racial term. They believed that caste was imposed upon the native aboriginals of India by the Aryan Sanskrit-speaking peoples who came into North India. To this, they pointed out that the term varna translated roughly as color. To them, this was color of skin, naturally. So they believed that caste was a way of regulating racial difference. And this would have made sense to 19th century Europeans and Americans familiar with slavery, segregation, and perceptions of European racial superiority. So to some scholars of India, the higher the caste, the more Aryan and more pure a group was. So this had geographical implications. This meant that North India was, in a way, more Aryan and pure than South India. But this is very tricky and very problematic. Of course, Indians have historically favored fair skin tones over darker skin tones. And even the great Indian epics refer to darker aboriginal races and slaves, or dasas. But color didn't always correspond directly with Varna caste rank. In India, Brahmins were not always more fair in skin tone than low castes. Untouchables and Shudras, likewise, were not always darker than Brahmins. Moreover, Indian Muslims who traced their descent from Persian and Arab conquerors often were the fairest of them all. If anything, skin tone was random and couldn't be explained by caste alone. Also, colonial caste studies and ethnographies, such as Herbert Risley's The People of India and Matthew Sharing's Hindu Tribes and Castes, as represented in Benares, made clear that India was defined by caste and hierarchy. Once these studies were in print, they actually became reference points for British magistrates, legal advocates, and Indian reformers. Yet these racial caste templates were also applied to British understandings of India's tribal populations. You see, some parts of central and eastern India were home to groups of people who were semi-nomadic, such as the Bhils and the Kalars. They were the Adivasis we discussed earlier, or tribal groups. Now, these groups did not revere Brahmins or settle the land, and they were seemingly non-Hindu in their cultural and customs. So Europeans wanted to figure out what accounted for these differences. So to Europeans, they were racially distinct, which meant that if they were not very Hindu, they had not been touched by caste. By extension, this meant that caste as a system was really a way of regulating race relations. One theorist, Walter Elliott, who was a contemporary of Thomas Huxley, studied these tribal groups and argued that since they held no reverence for Brahmins and didn't live settled Hindu lifestyles, caste was an evolutionary precautionary measure adopted by the earlier, fairer-skinned Aryan invaders to maintain their bloodline's purity. What else to these people could explain these tribals' isolations for thousands of years? And the expansion of the colonial cash crop economy also affected these tribal groups. More and more jute, cotton, indigo, and grains were grown for exports in lands that weren't cultivated. So the frontier farming expanded, and this brought caste Hindus and farmers who followed caste into contact with these tribal, semi-nomadic groups. Many of these tribal peoples were seen as unclean and avarna, or without caste, by both Europeans and Indians. And as these lands were settled and cultivated, these tribal groups were exposed to Brahmanical notions of social relations and ritual purity and hierarchy. These tribals were encouraged to settle the land, revere Brahmins, and to adopt Indian modes of social organization and customary behavior. So the expansion of the cash crop colonial economy, combined with the expansion of the statistical Raj after the early 1800s, had real effects upon how caste was perceived, regulated by the colonial state, and indeed practiced. So it's in this context that we should see how caste was affected by colonial rule. It clearly wasn't invented by the British, as crucial changes in the practice and functioning of caste had been transpiring before the British became rulers of India. But colonial policies did have the effect of making caste more traditional and Brahmin-centered. Moreover, the British came from a society back home that was itself defined by rank and privilege in terms of class. So to many officials, themselves of higher class back home, India seemed like a natural, if not ideal, country to rule. India had its own existent social hierarchy that nearly needed to be maintained. So what we can say is that caste was definitely made more important as a category and function under British colonialism. In sum, the British had the effect of making caste more rigid and enhancing these pre-existing notions of color and rank by making caste a legal category of reference. And this was the price, indeed one of many, paid for by the British pursuing their economic and strategic interests in the Indian subcontinent.